June 4th, 1942. A 19-year-old Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga felt the sudden jolt of enemy fire ripping through his aircraft. Below him, Dutch Harbor, Alaska, burned from his second strafing run. Above him, the gray Aleutian sky stretched endlessly in every direction, and somewhere beneath his feet, his oil line was severing, drip by drip, second by second. The oil pressure gauge needle began its fatal descent toward zero. Koga had minutes, maybe less. When the last drop of oil drained away, his engine would seize. His Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, the most feared combat aircraft in the Pacific, would become a falling coffin. He radioed his carrier. Engine failure imminent. Making emergency landing. Then he pointed his nose toward Akutan Island, 25 miles east, where a Japanese submarine waited to rescue downed pilots. He saw a beautiful mountain meadow below, covered in tall grass, perfect for an emergency landing. He lowered his landing gear and lined up his approach. What Tadayoshi Koga didn't know was that the innocent-looking meadow was actually a bog. What he didn't know was that his wingman, circling above, wouldn't have the heart to destroy his aircraft. And what he absolutely couldn't have known was that his desperate emergency landing was about to hand the United States the greatest intelligence prize of the Pacific War, an intact Zero fighter that would unravel every secret of Japan's unbeatable weapon. For 18 months, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero had been a nightmare that haunted every Allied pilot in the Pacific. It had appeared over China in 1940, where it achieved a staggering 12-to-1 victory ratio against Chinese fighters. It had dominated the skies over Pearl Harbor. It had slaughtered British Hurricanes over Ceylon and shredded American Wildcats from the Philippines to Guadalcanal. The Zero wasn't just superior to Allied fighters. It seemed invincible. American pilots returning from combat encounters told stories that intelligence officers initially dismissed as impossible. The Zero could turn inside anything they flew. It could climb faster than physics should allow. It could engage targets at ranges where American fighters couldn't even reach. And somehow, despite everything aeronautical engineers thought they understood about aircraft design, this lightweight Japanese fighter could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outfight every aircraft the Allies put in the sky. The statistics backed up the terror. In April 1942, 36 Zeros engaged 60 British aircraft over Ceylon. The British lost 27 planes. The Japanese lost 1. The kill ratio was so lopsided that Allied commanders began issuing desperate tactical directives. Don't dogfight with a Zero. Don't try to turn with it. If you see one on your tail, dive away and run. The list of what not to do grew longer each month. The list of tactics that actually worked was terrifyingly short. American fighter pilots arriving in the Pacific Theater heard the warnings immediately. Rear Admiral William Leonard, who would later become a fighter ace, described his first encounters with the Zero. "We were learning the folly of dogfighting with this mysterious aircraft," he wrote. From the way the Zero pilots maneuvered about, their aircraft was clearly superior to ours. American pilots watched helplessly as Zeros rolled through maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of aerodynamics. They watched their wingmen taken down by an enemy they couldn't match. The mystery of the invincible Zero was a secret the Allies desperately needed to unlock. Before we go any further, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Had you ever heard of Tadayoshi Koga or the Akutan Zero before today? Drop a quick comment and make sure you're subscribed. There's a lot more history the world forgot, and I'll be telling it here. Now, let's get back to it, because the greatest weapon the Zero possessed wasn't its maneuverability or its range. It was mystery. Allied intelligence desperately needed answers. What made this aircraft so devastatingly effective? What were its limitations? How could American pilots counter it and survive? But getting those answers required examining an actual Zero in flying condition, and every Zero brought down in combat arrived too damaged to reveal its secrets. 9 Zeros had been recovered from Pearl Harbor after the attack. Intelligence officers studied the wreckage and learned that the aircraft lacked armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. But the Zero's flight performance characteristics, the information that mattered in combat, remained completely unknown. In February 1942, a Zero crash-landed on Melville Island in Australia. It was too heavily damaged. Another Zero went down near Cape Rodney in New Guinea. Salvage crews chopped off the wings, severing the wing spars and rendering the hulk unflyable. A partly intact Zero was recovered in China, but it took months to reconstruct even a marginally functional aircraft. What American intelligence needed was a Zero they could actually fly. What they needed was a miracle. And on June 4th, 1942, 19-year-old Tadayoshi Koga was about to deliver exactly that. The Japanese attack on Dutch Harbor was part of a larger operation. While Admiral Yamamoto's main fleet moved toward Midway in the Central Pacific, a smaller Japanese carrier force under Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta struck the Aleutian Islands. The strategy was straightforward: occupy territory in the Aleutians, extend Japan's defensive perimeter northward, and prevent the United States from using Alaska as a springboard to attack the Japanese home islands. On June 3rd, the first wave of Japanese aircraft hit Dutch Harbor. 12 Zero fighters, 10 Kate high-level bombers, and 12 Val dive bombers launched from the carriers Ryujo and Junyo at 2:58 in the morning. Foul weather scattered half the formation, but 17 aircraft found their target. They bombed Army barracks, strafed radio stations, and attacked anti-aircraft positions. 25 Americans were taken down in the first strike. The Americans, having broken Japanese naval codes, were ready. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the harbor. Fighters from the 11th Air Force stood on alert at airfields on Umnak Island and Cold Bay. The Japanese returned the next morning, June 4th, with everything they had: 9 fighters, 11 dive bombers, 6 level bombers. Tadayoshi Koga flew in a 3-plane section of Zeros. His wingmen were Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Suguo Shikata. During the attack, Koga's section engaged a Navy PBY Catalina flying boat. The Catalina went down with all hands. Then, in the chaos of strafing runs and anti-aircraft fire from the 206th Coast Artillery Regiment below, Koga's Zero took a hit. Accounts conflict about exactly what struck his aircraft. Some claim it was a .50 caliber machine gun round from ground defenses. Others suggest it came from the Catalina's waist gunner before the flying boat went down. What matters is what happened next. The bullet, a single piece of metal, probably no larger than a finger, penetrated Koga's aircraft from above and severed the oil pressure gauge line behind the instrument panel. This cut off oil pressure from the gauge and stopped the flow of lubricant to the engine. Koga watched his oil pressure indicator drop to 0. He knew exactly what that meant. Without oil, the engine would overheat and seize within minutes. The math was simple and brutal. He had perhaps 5 minutes before the 940-horsepower Nakajima Sakai engine froze solid. Koga's radio call was calm and professional. "I expect my engine to freeze up momentarily. I've lost my oil pressure. I will make a forced landing on Akutan Island." His plan was textbook. Land on Akutan, which had been designated as an emergency landing area. Destroy the aircraft by burning it. Walk to the beach where a Japanese submarine waited to extract downed pilots. Return to the carrier. It should have worked. The 3 Zeros flew east to Akutan Island, 25 miles from Dutch Harbor. They circled a grassy flat half a mile inland from Broad Bight. From altitude, it looked perfect. A level meadow covered in grass, firm ground. Shikata, one of Koga's wingmen, thought the ground looked solid at first, but on his second pass, he noticed something: water glistening beneath the grass. He suddenly realized what Koga was about to land on. Not a meadow, a muskeg bog. Shikata tried to signal Koga to make a belly landing with the landing gear retracted, but it was too late. Koga had already lowered his landing gear and was committed to the approach. The Zero touched down. For a fraction of a second, it looked like a perfect landing. Then the landing gear plunged into the soft, waterlogged earth beneath the grass. The aircraft's momentum carried it forward. The wheels caught. The nose pitched down. And 19-year-old Tadayoshi Koga's Zero fighter flipped upside down and skidded to a stop in knee-deep mud and water. The impact broke Koga's neck. He died instantly, trapped in his cockpit, suspended upside down in the bog. His wingmen circled overhead. They had standing orders to destroy any Zero that crash-landed in enemy territory. But they didn't know if Koga was alive. They couldn't bring themselves to strafe his aircraft and possibly end their friend's life. They made the decision to leave without firing on the plane. The Japanese submarine stationed off Akutan searched for Koga for hours before being driven off by the destroyer USS Williamson. The crash site was out of sight of standard flight lanes. No ships could see it from the water. Koga's Zero lay inverted in the muskeg, undisturbed, invisible, forgotten. For 36 days, the greatest intelligence prize of the Pacific War sat in an Alaskan bog, hidden by fog and weather. While the war raged on, American forces didn't know it existed. Japanese forces assumed it had been destroyed. The Zero that would change everything remained untouched in its cold, muddy grave. Then, on July 10, 1942, Lieutenant William Thies and his crew took off from Dutch Harbor in a PBY Catalina for a routine patrol. Thies was using dead reckoning navigation, estimating position based on speed, time, and direction. Somewhere over the Aleutian fog, he got lost. When he spotted the Shumagin Islands through a break in the clouds, he reoriented his aircraft and began returning to Dutch Harbor by the most direct route, over Akutan Island. Machinist mate Albert Knack was serving as plane captain, the crew member responsible for the aircraft's maintenance. He was scanning the ground when he saw something impossible. An aircraft, upside down, in the middle of a bog, with red circles on its wings. Knack shouted to Thies. The Catalina circled the crash site for several minutes. Thies noted the position on his map and immediately returned to Dutch Harbor to report the find. The reaction at Naval Headquarters was electric. An intact Zero, the first one they'd had any chance of recovering in flyable condition. Thies convinced his commanding officer, Paul Foley, to let him return with a salvage team. The next day, July 11th, Thies and his crew flew back to Akutan with Navy photographer Arthur Baumann. They landed near the crash site and waded through the bog to reach the aircraft. What they found exceeded their wildest expectations. The Zero was almost completely intact. The soft muskeg that had ended Koga's life had also cushioned the aircraft's impact. The fuselage was undamaged, the wings were intact, the engine was salvageable. This wasn't wreckage, this was a treasure. Thies's team worked carefully. They extracted Koga's body from the cockpit by having Knack, the smallest crew member, crawl up inside the inverted aircraft and cut the pilot's safety harness. They searched the plane for documents and equipment of intelligence value. They buried Koga in a shallow grave near the crash site. Then they turned their attention to the aircraft itself. Any Alaskan who has ever tried to cross Muskeg on foot understands what the salvage crews faced. Removing a 2.5-ton fighter aircraft partially buried in knee-deep mud and transporting it to the coast required engineering, muscle, and sheer determination. It took 3 separate salvage attempts. Crews sank into the bog. Equipment got stuck. The Zero, despite being made of lightweight aluminum, became a nearly immovable object in the soft earth. Finally, after weeks of brutal work, they succeeded. The Zero was disassembled, loaded onto a barge, and transported to Dutch Harbor. From there, it was shipped to Naval Air Station San Diego in California. The date was late July 1942. The Americans now possessed the first intact, potentially flyable Zero of the war. What they would learn from it would save thousands of American lives. At NAS North Island in San Diego, Navy mechanics began the restoration immediately. They salvaged what they could and fabricated the few replacement parts needed. The fuselage panels aft of the cowling had been damaged during transport, so they built new ones. They repaired the landing gear that had plunged into the Akutan bog. They restored the engine. They worked with a sense of urgency that came from knowing American pilots were dying every day in combat against this aircraft. On September 20th, 1942, just 2 months after the Zero's discovery and 3.5 months after it crashed, the aircraft was ready. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders walked across the tarmac at NAS San Diego toward the Zero fighter, now repainted in American colors. Sanders was an experienced test pilot. He'd flown dozens of different aircraft types. But as he climbed into the cockpit of the enemy's most feared fighter, he knew this flight would be different. This wasn't just a test flight. This was the moment American intelligence would finally understand what they were fighting. Sanders started the engine. The 940-horsepower Nakajima Sakai radial came to life with a distinctive sound. He taxied to the runway, advanced the throttle, and felt the Zero leap into the air. And in that first flight, Sanders discovered secrets that would transform how America fought the Pacific Air War. The very first flight exposed weaknesses of the Zero, which our pilots could exploit with proper tactics, Sanders reported. What he found would be distributed to every fighter squadron in the Pacific Theater. The most critical discovery came at high speed. Immediately apparent was the fact that the ailerons froze up at speeds above 200 knots, Sanders wrote. Rolling maneuvers at those speeds were slow and required much force on the control stick. This was the key. The Zero's legendary maneuverability existed only at lower speeds. Push the aircraft beyond 200 knots, about 230 miles per hour, and the controls became almost impossibly heavy. The pilot needed significant physical strength just to force the stick over. Sanders discovered the Zero rolled to the left much easier than to the right. This asymmetry meant American pilots could exploit a directional advantage in combat. He discovered that the engine cut out under negative acceleration due to its float-type carburetor. This was revolutionary intelligence. When an American pilot pushed his aircraft into a vertical power dive, subjecting the aircraft to negative G-forces, his fuel-injected engine kept running. The Zero's carburetor-fed engine would starve and stop. Sanders wrote the tactical doctrine that would be distributed throughout the Pacific. We now had the answer for our pilots who were being outmaneuvered and unable to escape a pursuing Zero. Go into a vertical power dive, using negative acceleration if possible, to open the range while the Zero's engine is stopped by the acceleration. At about 200 knots, roll hard right before the Zero pilot can get his sights lined up. Sanders made 24 test flights between September 20th and October 15th, 1942. Every flight revealed more exploitable characteristics. The Zero's legendary turn rate was real. At low speeds, it could turn inside any American fighter. But sustained turning combat bled energy from the lightweight aircraft faster than it bled energy from heavier American fighters. The Zero's range was extraordinary, over 1,600 miles, but this came at a cost. To achieve that range, Japanese engineers had eliminated armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. American fighters carried armor behind the pilot's seat and fuel tanks that would seal themselves when punctured. The Zero had neither. Following Sanders's initial flights, Navy test pilot Lieutenant Melvin Boogie Hoffman took over the Akutan Zero. Hoffman's mission was different from Sanders's. Where Sanders had conducted performance testing, Hoffman would conduct combat testing. Hoffman flew the captured Zero against every frontline American fighter, Wildcats, Corsairs, later the Hellcats. He invited recently commissioned Navy pilots to dogfight him. He tested the Zero's capabilities against American pilots who were about to deploy to the Pacific. And he taught them how to win. The intelligence gained from the Akutan Zero was disseminated through multiple channels. Tactical bulletins went to every fighter squadron in the Pacific. Technical aviation intelligence, brief number 3, contained detailed performance data. Informational intelligence. Summary 59 provided combat recommendations. Training films showed footage of the captured Zero being flown against American aircraft. The information spread through the fleet like wildfire. Marine pilot Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Walsh, who would be credited with 21 destroyed enemy aircraft during the war, later said, "Knowing what to do with a Zero on my tail, information that came from Koga's Zero, saved my life several times." Fighter ace William Leonard, who would retire as a rear admiral, stated, "The captured Zero was a treasure. To my knowledge, no other captured machine has ever unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great. The tactical revolution happened quickly. American pilots arriving in the Pacific after late 1942 fought the Zero differently than their predecessors had. They no longer tried to turn with the Japanese fighter at low speeds. They used speed and altitude. They employed hit-and-run tactics, diving down on Zeros from above, making a single high-speed pass, then climbing away before the enemy could react. They exploited the Zero's poor high-speed handling by forcing combat at velocities above 200 knots. Most importantly, American pilots stopped viewing the Zero as invincible. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For 18 months, the Zero had been a mythical enemy that seemed unbeatable. Now, American pilots understood it was an aircraft with specific strengths and specific weaknesses. Strengths they could avoid, weaknesses they could exploit. The mystery was gone, and with it, much of the Zero's psychological advantage evaporated. The captured Zero remained in service throughout the war. In 1943, it was displayed at Washington National Airport as a war prize. In 1944, it was recalled to NAS North Island to serve as a training aircraft for rookie pilots deploying to the Pacific. A captured Model 52-0 from Guam was later added to the training program. Thousands of American pilots saw demonstrations of the Zero's capabilities and limitations before they ever encountered one in combat. Japanese historian and Lieutenant General Masatake Okumiya, writing after the war, assessed the impact bluntly. The acquisition of the Akutan Zero was no less serious than the Japanese defeat at the Battle of Midway. Another Japanese officer commented bitterly, "We spent months trying to capture a Spitfire intact so we could study its improvements. The Americans didn't have to try. We delivered our best fighter directly to them." The Akutan Zero met its end in February 1945 in a training accident. Commander Richard Crommelin was taxiing the Zero at NAS San Diego when a Curtiss Helldiver dive bomber lost control and rammed into it. The Helldiver's propeller chopped through the Zero's fuselage aft of the cockpit. The legendary aircraft that had survived combat over Dutch Harbor, a crash landing in an Alaskan bog, and 3 years of intensive testing was scrapped. William Leonard salvaged several gauges from the wreckage and donated them to the National Museum of the United States Navy. The Alaska Heritage Museum and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum have small pieces of the aircraft. Tadayoshi Koga's body remained buried on Akutan Island until 1947, when an American Graves Registration Service team exhumed it and reburied him on Adak Island, further down the Aleutian chain. In 1988, author Jim Reardon and Japanese businessman Minoru Kawamoto attempted to repatriate Koga's remains to Japan, but bureaucratic complications prevented it. The story of the Akutan Zero illustrates a fundamental truth about technological warfare. Japan's Mitsubishi A6M Zero represented a quantum leap in fighter design when it appeared in 1940. For 18 months, it dominated every Allied aircraft through superior performance, innovative engineering, and the skill of experienced Japanese pilots. But that advantage lasted only as long as the aircraft remained mysterious. The moment American engineers could examine an actual Zero, test its flight characteristics, and devise countermeasures, the balance shifted. The Zero's low-speed maneuverability came at the cost of high-speed control authority. Its exceptional range came at the cost of pilot protection and survivability. Its lightweight construction came at the cost of structural durability. Once American pilots understood these trade-offs, they stopped fighting the Zero on its terms and started fighting it on theirs. They used their advantages, speed, armor, and firepower, to negate the Zero's strengths. By 1943 and 1944, the air war in the Pacific had transformed. New American fighters, the Hellcat, the Corsair, the Lightning, and later the Mustang, were designed with lessons learned from the Akutan Zero. These aircraft emphasized high-speed performance, heavy armor, and devastating firepower. They were flown by well-trained pilots who understood exactly how to engage Japanese fighters and win. The kill ratios reversed. American pilots who had once fled from Zeros now hunted them. Today, surviving Zero fighters are displayed in aviation museums as masterpieces of Japanese engineering. And they are. The Zero was a remarkable aircraft that reflected innovative design thinking and a clear understanding of what naval aviation required. But the aircraft's reputation is forever linked to the intelligence coup that revealed its secrets. In the complex calculus of wartime advantage, one bullet that severed an oil line, one emergency landing in an Alaskan bog, one pilot's decision not to destroy his friend's aircraft, changed the trajectory of the Pacific Air War. The lesson echoes through military history. Superior technology matters, but intelligence matters more. Understanding your enemy's capabilities and limitations can be worth more than building a better weapon. And sometimes the greatest victories come not from devastating attacks or heroic battles, but from accidents that give you exactly what you've been desperately seeking. Tadayoshi Koga launched from the carrier Ryujo on the morning of June 4, 1942, as a skilled pilot flying the most advanced fighter in the Pacific. He never made it home. He died believing he had failed, that his emergency landing was nothing more than a tragic end to a routine combat mission. He never knew that his wingman's mercy would become America's greatest advantage. He never knew that his aircraft would be restored, tested, and flown by the enemy he had been trained to defeat. He never knew that thousands of American pilots would study his Zero's weaknesses before ever encountering one in combat. And he never knew that historians would remember his name not for the victories he achieved, but for the one accidental gift that taught America how to win the Pacific War. One oil line, one emergency landing. One moment of compassion from wingmen who couldn't pull the trigger. That's how 19-year-old Tadayoshi Koga changed history. And never knew it.